Number 1. Joshua Datsun. Shelby County, Tennessee, wakes each day to a slow and familiar rhythm. Quiet side streets, modest homes, and carefully kept lawns create a sense of safety people believe will last forever. Neighbors greet one another with knowing glances, children play on front porches, and it feels like fear has no place to enter. But within that calm, a tragedy was quietly taking shape. There were no sirens, no obvious warnings, just an individual living among the community, carrying unresolved anger beneath a seemingly ordinary life. When darkness hides behind normalcy for too long, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And in Shelby County, that moment arrived, shattering innocent lives and breaking the fragile belief that evil is always something distant, something that happens somewhere else. Joshua Datsun was not the kind of person people typically imagine when they think of a killer. In his early 20s, he looked like countless other young men in Shelby County. An unremarkable face, simple clothing, someone who could blend into a crowd without leaving any lasting impression. On social media, Datsun's life appeared almost painfully ordinary. Casual photos, brief status updates, conversations that seemed harmless on the surface. To outsiders, he looked like a young man still trying to find his place in the world. But those who spent more time around him sensed something wasn't quite right. Datsun showed unpredictable shifts in mood-long periods of silence, followed by sudden bursts of anger over minor issues. He craved attention and control, yet carefully hid these urges behind a mask of normalcy. And that normalcy was the most unsettling part, because no one realized that behind those seemingly harmless eyes, a troubled inner world was slowly drifting beyond the boundaries of reason. Looking back at Joshua Datsun's childhood, there is no single traumatic event that clearly explains what would later unfold. There was no defining moment that shattered his life. Instead, there were small fractures, quiet, gradual, and stretching across years. From an early age, Datsun was described as unpredictable, quick to anger, and prone to overreacting to minor conflicts. His outbursts would surface suddenly, then fade just as fast, leaving behind an uneasy and confusing silence. He developed an early fascination with dark imagery, horror films, and fictional stories centered on violent characters. While many children encountered such material briefly and moved on, Datsun clung to it, treating it as a private world of his own. In that world, harm was not condemned, it was framed as a source of power and control. Family members and friends dismissed it as an unsettling phase of adolescence, something he would eventually outgrow. But those fixations never faded. They quietly grew alongside him, shaping a distorted view of the world, one where fear and dominance slowly replaced empathy and moral boundaries. Jamisha Kopson entered Joshua Datsun's life as a rare source of emotional stability. To those around her, she was a gentle young woman, someone who carried quiet hopes for a steady and meaningful future. Their relationship began like many others, calm moments, simple promises, and the comfort of not feeling alone. Over time, however, that sense of connection became overshadowed by control and jealousy. Datsun struggled with the idea of being left behind, unable to accept losing someone who had become central to his world. When the relationship ended, the separation did not bring closure. Instead, it turned into an obsession. Jamisha's pregnancy added further strain to an already fragile situation. To her, it represented new life, responsibility, and hope. To Datsun, it triggered feelings of challenge and loss of control. Between two people who once cared deeply for each other, understanding slowly faded, replaced by unresolved tension and growing emotional distance. And within that heavy, unspoken atmosphere, a tragedy began to take shape quietly, steadily, and with a sense that it could no longer be avoided. Everything did not erupt from a direct confrontation, but from a single Facebook post. Just a few short lines, buried among the countless ordinary updates people scroll past every day. For Jamisha, it may have been nothing more than an emotional release, a message reflecting the new life she was trying to build. But in Joshua Datsun's mind, those words carried a very different weight. He read them through a lens of hurt, jealousy, and deep personal offense. The anger that had been quietly building for so long finally found an outlet. The line between thought and action began to blur. It was a moment when reason no longer guided his choices, when he allowed resentment to take control. And in a very short span of time, what seemed like a minor act in the digital world became the spark that pushed the unfolding tragedy past the point of no return. The moment the tragedy unfolded was brief, but its consequences can never be erased. When the sound of gunfire broke the silence, Jememsha Kopson collapsed along with the life she had not yet had the chance to bring into the world. There was no time to run, no chance to speak. Only a heavy stillness remained, the kind that follows actions that cannot be undone. For those left behind, it was not just the loss of two lives, but the collapse of a future that should have stretched far ahead. An investigation began immediately, and the pieces quickly fell into place. Mobile phone data placed Joshua Datsun at the location at the exact time the incident occurred. Forensic analysis directly linked his firearm to the shots that ended Jememsha's life. Witnesses confirmed seeing Datsun in the area shortly before and after the gunfire. Each piece of evidence alone raised serious concern. Taken together, they formed a clear and chilling picture. What troubled investigators most was not only the strength of the evidence, but the origin of the act itself. A social media post, an unmanaged surge of anger, a decision made in a moment of emotional blindness. The case of Jememsha Kopson reveals just how fragile the line can be between everyday life and irreversible tragedy. It is a reminder that harm does not always begin with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it grows from something small, overlooked, yet powerful enough to destroy everything. The death of Jememsha Kopson was not the end, it was the doorway to an even colder truth. As investigators widened the scope of the case, they discovered that Joshua Datsun was not responsible for just one life lost. His name soon appeared alongside others: Divian Parker, Reida Bennett, Reginald Anderson. Each name represented a full life, daily routines, relationships, plans that would never be realized. But to Datsun, they gradually became targets. The incidents shared a disturbing pattern: quiet surveillance, swift action, and a complete disregard for consequences. In some cases, unintended shots narrowly missed innocent bystanders, revealing an increasing level of recklessness and indifference. In court, Datsun showed no remorse. He faced justice with a chilling calm, at times even displaying pride in what he had done. But the legal system remained unmoved. Sentence after sentence was handed down, stacking one upon another as a final statement from society. In total, 261 years in prison. A staggering number not only as punishment, but as a guarantee that Joshua Datsun will never again have the chance to destroy another life. Number 2. Oscar Solis Jr. Holiday, Florida, often becomes especially calm as night falls. Quiet streets see little traffic, and porch lights cast a soft glow, just enough to make everything feel safe. It's the kind of stillness that lowers people's guard, convincing them they're simply moving through another ordinary evening. A food delivery driver begins his shift, traveling from one home to the next, carrying takeout bags and the familiar fatigue of a long workday. He has no idea that one door he is about to approach will become the final boundary between life and death. Within that silence, a tragedy is already waiting, hidden behind the outward appearance of an ordinary home, in a place where no one would expect danger to be lurking. At the time, Oscar Solis Jr. was 30 years old. To the neighbors around him, he was not someone who stood out. He wasn't flashy, wealthy, or particularly memorable, just another face in the neighborhood. But beneath that unremarkable exterior was a past marked by instability. Solis grew up in an environment filled with turmoil and early exposure to crime and conflict. Prior to the incident, he had only recently been released from prison after serving several years for assault and robbery. Returning to society did not bring him peace. Instead, it deepened his sense of isolation and resentment. He carried with him years of bottled-up anger from incarceration, along with a belief that the world was fundamentally against him. Those who had interacted with Solis described him as volatile and unpredictable, someone constantly on edge, always defensive, as if confrontation were the only way he knew how to survive. Oscar Salas Jr. Record reflects a familiar pattern of repeat offending. His encounters with law enforcement were not isolated incidents, but part of a cycle that continued over time. In the past, aggression had given him a sense of control, and that feeling never truly went away. Investigators later examined possible links between Salas and organized criminal groups, though no direct evidence connected the incident to gang activity. Even so, his history made one thing clear: Salas was no stranger to using force to get what he wanted. The fact that he had been released only months before the incident raised difficult questions. Were warning signs overlooked? And was society truly prepared for the return of someone who had never fully let go of a violent mindset? The victim in this case was not someone he knew. There was no prior conflict, no personal history, no warning signs. He was simply a food delivery driver, someone working a demanding but honest job, trying to make a living. Waiting for him was a family, people who expected him to return home after a routine evening shift. For them, it was just another ordinary day, with no reason to feel afraid. And it was that very sense of normalcy that made the loss even more painful. He stepped into the night thinking about his next delivery, unaware that he was about to encounter someone who was prepared to take a life for property and to release long-held anger. In a moment, a routine job turned into an irreversible tragedy, leaving behind questions and a family forever changed. When the delivery driver arrived, there were no signs of danger. Nothing suggested that the situation would turn tragic. But within a brief moment, everything spiraled out of control. According to investigators, the original intent was robbery. However, tension, panic, and an ingrained reliance on aggression pushed the situation far beyond that point. The line between intimidation and taking a life disappeared. Decisions made in a matter of seconds altered two destinies. Forever one life was lost, and another was set on a path with no way back. When police arrived at the scene, the evidence spoke in a cold, unmistakable way. Inside the home were clear signs of a violent struggle, telling the story without the need for words. The victim's personal belongings, car keys, a wedding ring, were found scattered across the floor, like the final fragments of a life abruptly cut short. The body was later discovered concealed in trash bags behind the residence, pointing to a desperate attempt to hide what had happened. Surveillance footage captured critical moments, and physical evidence closely matched witness statements and forensic findings. Every trail led back to Oscar Salas Jr. Investigators quickly concluded that this was not merely a sudden loss of control, but the result of opportunity colliding with a deeply ingrained pattern of aggression, one that had been building long before that night. Oscar Salas Jr. was taken into custody and charged with murder in the course of a robbery. Given his serious criminal history, he now faces the possibility of the death penalty under Florida law. The case left a deep impact on the local community. What was meant to be a routine delivery ended in loss, forcing many to question how safe everyday routines truly are. A simple knock on a door became a turning point that no one could have anticipated. Salas's story serves as a chilling reminder that danger can remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. And in just a single moment, it can shatter one life and leave lasting pain for countless others left behind. Number 3. Todd Gibbons. Flames rose into the night, wrapping around an abandoned vehicle left in a remote, overgrown area of California. From a distance, it appeared to be nothing more than an unfortunate accident, another isolated incident on a road rarely traveled. The glow against the dark sky drew the attention of firefighters, who responded as they would to any routine call. But as they moved closer, something felt wrong. The silence was heavy, and the scene carried an unsettling weight. Inside the burned-out vehicle was not an empty shell of metal. A body was discovered. And the evidence soon revealed a disturbing truth: the fire was not the beginning of the story. It was the final step in a crime that had been carefully set in motion long before the flames ever appeared. Todd Gibbons never truly found a place within society. Those who had known him described someone volatile, quick to anger, and constantly burdened by a sense of being rejected by the world. He lived a transient life, moving from place to place, unable to form any lasting connections. To outsiders, Gibbons appeared deeply unstable, but few imagined he was capable of becoming a calculated killer. His actions were not driven by a sudden impulse. The coldness in his eyes and the way he carried himself suggested someone long familiar with aggression. For Gibbons, causing harm to others was not an unfamiliar boundary to cross. It had become part of how he asserted his existence, a distorted means of feeling seen in a world he believed had already turned its back on him. Over time, Todd Gibbons's isolation did not lead to withdrawal, it hardened into hatred. He became drawn to extremist beliefs, where harm was justified through distorted ideals. Ideas of racial superiority gradually replaced any remaining moral boundaries. In Gibbons's mind, the world was divided into allies, and enemies, he believed, did not deserve to live. Investigators later concluded that this ideology formed the foundation of his actions. This was not a brief surge of anger. It was a process of long-term preparation, where destructive beliefs were reinforced over time, waiting patiently for the moment to be carried out. The two victims of Todd Gibbons had no idea they were about to step into a defining moment of their lives. Their initial encounter carried no sense of danger. It was simply an interaction between strangers, no prior conflict, no reason for suspicion. But in Gibbons's mind, they had already been assigned a role within the distorted world he had created. Each victim was a human being with family, history, and a future of their own. None of that existed in his thinking. To him, they were no longer individuals, but outlets for the hatred he had carried for far too long, targets onto whom he could release emotions that had been building in isolation and resentment. Once the line was crossed, everything unfolded with terrifying speed. The harm did not happen just once, but twice in rapid succession. Todd Gibbons acted with a chilling calm, no hesitation, no visible remorse. After 2 lives were taken, he did not seek help or attempt to flee right away. Instead, he chose to conceal what he had done. The vehicle was set on fire not to save anyone, but to erase evidence, as if flames could burn away responsibility and silence the memory of what had occurred. The fire scene quickly revealed that this was no accident. Forensic evidence showed that the victims had already lost their lives before the flames began. Physical findings and ballistic evidence directly connected the scene to Todd Gibbons. Investigators followed a trail of clues from his known locations to personal belongings, weapons, and witness accounts. Every detail pointed to careful planning, from the initial acts to the deliberate attempt to destroy evidence afterward. In court, experts laid out the sequence of events step by step, ruling out any claim of self-defense or accident. The truth emerged clearly: cold, calculated, and impossible to deny. Todd Gibbons was sentenced to death. But the verdict did not bring an end to violence in his life. Even behind bars, Gibbons continued to immerse himself in aggression, forming ties with extremist prison groups. The years that followed were marked by repeated assaults and disciplinary violations, clear signs that violence was not just something he did, but something deeply rooted in who he had become. The case of Todd Gibbons leaves behind a heavy message. When hatred is nurtured into an ideology, it does more than lives, it destroys any remaining chance of turning back. The fire once used in an attempt to conceal the crime ultimately served only one purpose: to illuminate the dark path he had chosen long before that night. Number 4. Kenny McBride. Morning in a small Michigan town began like any other. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating a home with no visible signs of trouble. No shattered glass, no cries for help. Nothing to suggest that something unthinkable had taken place overnight. And it was that very silence that made the moment so unsettling. A father stepped into the living room, expecting the familiar calm of an ordinary morning. Instead, he was confronted with a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Inside the place that should have been the safest, a life had been taken. And the person responsible was not a stranger. It was someone from within the family itself. Kenny McBride was not someone living on the fringes of society. He was a familiar presence to those around him, a man with a family, with clear and close blood ties. Yet there was always an underlying tension that followed him, something difficult to put into words. People who knew McBride described him as short-tempered, quick to anger, and burdened by long-standing resentment that was never fully resolved. His past included legal troubles and repeated confrontations, patterns that revealed how poorly he handled conflict and emotional pressure. Even so, no one imagined that this anger would erupt inside his own family home, or that it would be directed toward the very person who should have been safest under that roof. Kenny McBride's record shows that this was not his first encounter with serious trouble. Prior offenses reflected a familiar pattern: conflict, aggression, and an ongoing inability to control his emotions. His family had witnessed these outbursts before, but like many families, they chose to believe they were temporary moments that would pass with time. Warning signs appeared again and again, yet never seemed severe enough to convince anyone that a true tragedy was possible. In everyday life, volatility is often dismissed as a personality flaw rather than a serious risk until the moment it crosses a line from which there is no return. Cecilia Gibson, 79 years old, was a woman who had devoted most of her life to her family. At that age, her world was far removed from conflict or danger. Her days were shaped by slow, familiar routines, the kind that come with a lifetime of care and responsibility. To her family, she represented patience, stability, and the quiet strength that holds generations together. But on that fateful night, she became the victim of someone from within her own family. Not in a dark alley or an unfamiliar place, but inside the home she believed was safe. Her loss did not take just one life, it shattered the very idea of family as a final refuge, a place where trust is absolute and harm should never exist. The argument grew out of long simmering family tensions. Words were exchanged, and years of suppressed frustration surfaced all at once. For Kenny McBride, it was the moment when anger took full control. The harm did not stop at a single impulsive act. By the time everything was over, moral boundaries had been completely erased. What made the case especially chilling was that McBride did not flee afterward. He remained inside the home, facing the consequences of his own actions, as if the rage had drained away, leaving behind a hollow stillness that could never be undone. When police arrived, the scene revealed clear signs of a violent struggle. The condition of the home and the physical evidence told the story without the need for words. Investigators quickly focused on Kenny McBride, who had visible injuries to his hands and head, consistent with a physical confrontation. Forensic analysis, fingerprints, and phone data all confirmed his presence at the house at the time the incident occurred. There were no signs of forced entry and no indication of another suspect. Every lead pointed in the same direction. In court, experts carefully reconstructed the sequence of events, ruling out any possibility of an accident or self-defense. The legal picture slowly closed in clear, complete, and impossible to dispute. The jury found Kenny McBride guilty. As a repeat offender, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest penalty under Michigan law. For the family, the verdict could never bring back the life that was lost. But it did affirm a critical truth: violence cannot be excused or tolerated, even when it comes from within one's own family. The case of Kenny McBride stands as a painful reminder of what unchecked anger can destroy even the most sacred relationships. A home that once symbolized safety became the site of tragedy, leaving an impact that will linger long after the sentence was handed down. Number 5. Joshua Cattrall. The surface of the lake was calm, almost indifferent. No strong waves, no unusual sounds, just still water reflecting the gray skies of Kentucky. Yet years earlier, this very place had swallowed a horrifying secret. A heavy suitcase had been thrown into the lake, carrying not only a body, but a desperate attempt to bury the truth itself. To those who lived nearby, the lake remained part of everyday life, quiet, unchanged, and unassuming. No one suspected that beneath its depths, a carefully hidden crime was waiting to resurface, one that would later unravel into a chain of events even more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Joshua Cattrall grew up in an unstable childhood. Records show that he spent many years moving through foster homes, never having a lasting sense of security or belonging. Feelings of abandonment and anger slowly built up over time, shaping someone impulsive and difficult to control. Even as a teenager, Cattrall had repeated run-ins with the law, a pattern that suggested he struggled to find his place in society. As he reached adulthood, those inner conflicts did not disappear. They simply took on new forms, becoming more dangerous when mixed with desperation and a growing fear that his past would one day come to light. At the age of 21, Joshua Cattrall encountered his first victim inside a small motel room. What began as a confrontation quickly escalated beyond control. After the life was taken, Cattrall did not contact authorities or seek help. Instead, he chose to hide what had happened. The body was placed inside a suitcase, moved out of the room, and eventually discarded in a nearby lake. The act was not only an attempt to erase evidence, but a reflection of deep fear of facing responsibility and the consequences of his actions. Cattrall was arrested, but he was not convicted of the highest level of homicide. He received a reduced conviction, along with related charges. The case closed quietly, leaving the impression that the story had reached its end when in reality, it was only the beginning. Joshua Cattrall served many years in prison. After his release, he lived quietly, keeping a low profile and staying out of public attention. For a long time, there were no major incidents connected to his name. To some, this appeared to be a sign of change. But to investigators looking back, that silence was unsettling. A past that is never fully confronted does not disappear, it simply lies dormant. Cattrall carried with him the memory of the suitcase and the lake, along with a constant fear that the truth could resurface at any moment. Years later, an emergency call brought police to a home in Kentucky. Inside, they discovered the bodies of a woman and her 13-year-old child. The scene showed clear signs of severe harm and evidence that the bodies had been moved. In that moment, the past and the present collided. What had once been hidden beneath the surface of a lake returned heavier, darker, and far more devastating. A line had been crossed once again, and this time, the consequences were even more painful than before. As the investigation expanded, the name Joshua Cattrall quickly resurfaced. Neighbors confirmed seeing him at the house around the time the incident occurred. Police later located Cattrall nearby, with clear traces linking him to the scene. Prosecutors did not ignore his past. The long-buried suitcase case was brought back into focus, not as history, but as a crucial key to understanding a pattern of behavior. Forensic analysis, witness statements, and physical evidence slowly came together, forming a deeply troubling picture. To investigators, this was no coincidence. It was a cycle of harm stretching across decades, rooted in fear of exposure, and ending with the loss of innocent lives. Joshua Cattrall is currently awaiting trial for the new case. Under the law, he is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Yet the severity of what has unfolded has left the community deeply shaken. One life was lost years ago, hidden away in a suitcase beneath the surface of a lake. Another case later claimed the lives of a mother and her child. Between those two tragedies lie years of incarceration, release, and silence. The story of Joshua Cattrall raises a difficult and haunting question: were the warning signs always there, simply unseen, or was there a moment when intervention could have changed everything? Before it was too late. Number 6. Brian Ontiveros. Morning in San Antonio began like any other. Traffic moved through familiar apartment complexes, windows opened to welcome the sunlight, and life continued at its steady, predictable pace with no hint that anything was wrong. Inside a small apartment, a young mother was trying to rebuild after a painful separation, focusing on her son and the simple plans she hoped would guide them forward. No one in the building knew that behind that closed door, a tragedy was about to unfold. There were no raised voices, no obvious warnings, just the quiet presence of someone from the past, someone who had never truly let go, and who carried an obsession that refused to fade. Brian Ontiveros was often described as intensely emotional, passionate, deeply attached, and unable to accept loss. In relationships, he struggled to let go. When he cared for someone, he held on tightly. And when he was rejected, those feelings did not fade, they hardened into resentment. For Ontiveros, a breakup did not mean closure. It felt like a personal insult, a loss of control he was unwilling to accept. People who knew him later recalled patterns of monitoring, persistent attempts to reconnect, and a disregard for personal boundaries. It was the kind of behavior that is often minimized or overlooked until the consequences become impossible to reverse. If you're ready, you can continue sending the next part. I'll keep translating with the same American English, YouTube-appropriate tone, and careful wording. After the relationship ended, Brian Ontiveros never truly left on an emotional level. He remained fixated on his former partner's life, tracking changes and watching for any sign that she was trying to move on. Jealousy was no longer a passing feeling, it became a constant state of mind. Prosecutors later described this as a process of psychological escalation, where rejection was reinterpreted as hostility. Ontiveros no longer saw a person with the right to choose her own path. Instead, he saw something he believed had been taken from him, and something he was determined to reclaim at any cost. That obsession steadily pushed him closer to an act that would forever alter multiple lives. Marisa Jernigan was only 20 years old. A young mother, she devoted most of her time to her son while trying to rebuild her life after the relationship ended. Those around her said she was actively distancing herself from the past, searching for stability and safety. For Marisa, leaving Ontiveros was a necessary step to protect both herself and her child. But the peace she was seeking did not exist in his mind. Instead, she became the focus of his need for control and jealousy, despite having done nothing wrong. Marisa's story reflects a painful reality. Leaving a dangerous relationship does not always mean escaping the danger itself. On June 8, 2019, Brian Ontiveros appeared at Marisa's apartment. According to investigators, he forced his way inside. What followed unfolded quickly, leaving no room for discussion or resolution. Several gunshots echoed within the confined space of the apartment. When a friend arrived shortly afterward, Marisa was found on the floor, critically injured and fading. Despite efforts to help her, she did not survive. In a matter of minutes, a violent decision took the life of a young mother and left behind a child who would grow up without her. After the shooting, Brian Ontiveros disappeared. The investigation quickly turned into a manhunt. His image was circulated through media outlets and crime alert programs as authorities worked to track his movements. Evidence soon indicated that Ontiveros had left the United States, crossing the border into Mexico. For nearly 3 years, he lived in hiding, effectively vanishing, while Marisa's family endured prolonged grief and unanswered questions. In 2022, U.S. federal agents, working in coordination with Mexican authorities, located and arrested Ontiveros. His extradition marked a critical turning point, bringing the case back into the hands of the justice system. In court, prosecutors laid out a clear sequence of evidence, from the forced entry and gunfire to his flight from the country, demonstrating that the act was deliberate and planned, not a momentary loss of control. The jury needed only a few hours to return a guilty verdict. Brian Ontiveros was sentenced to life in prison. There would be no return to freedom, no chance to resume the life he once had. For Marisa Jernigan's family, the sentence could never fill the void she left behind. A child will grow up without a mother. The case of Brian Ontiveros stands as a painful warning about the dangers of jealousy and control. When personal boundaries are violated, the damage does not end with a single life, it spreads outward, leaving wounds that never fully heal for those left behind. Number 7. Edward Figueroa. From the outside, the house in Texas looked completely ordinary. Lights glowed softly behind the curtains, and the neighborhood remained quiet, just like any other night. No one passing by could have known that behind those closed doors, an argument was unfolding, one that would end in a way that could never be undone. It was the kind of space people believed to be safe, a private setting for personal emotions. Yet it is often in places like this that domestic violence exists quietly, without cries for help and without witnesses. That night, the silence outside concealed a tragedy taking shape. With every passing minute, someone inside was being drawn closer to a moment that would cost them everything. Edward Figueroa, born in 1980, was not a name commonly associated with scandal or a notable criminal past. To those who knew him, he appeared to be a mature man in a steady relationship, living what seemed to be a relatively quiet and ordinary life. But beneath that surface was a relationship marked by tension. Small, unresolved conflicts slowly accumulated, creating constant, unspoken pressure. Figueroa was not someone known for open or frequent aggression, yet he carried a strong need for control and reacted intensely when that control was challenged. It was the kind of instability that often goes unnoticed until it reveals itself in the worst possible moment. The relationship between Edward Figueroa and Catherine Gibson was never truly stable. People close to them later recalled frequent arguments, long discussions that grew increasingly intense over time. Jealousy, suspicion, and a deep sense of insecurity lingered between them. These are warning signs commonly found in unhealthy relationships, yet they are often minimized, especially when everything unfolds behind closed doors. No one outside heard the cutting words. No one witnessed the ongoing tension. And as a result, no one intervened before the situation crossed a line that could not be undone. Catherine Gibson was just 24 years old, still very young, with countless plans yet to be realized. In her relationship with Figueroa, she searched for love while also carrying heavy emotional pressure. Those who knew her said Catherine tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, believing that things could be worked through. She was not the source of the conflict, yet she ultimately became its victim. Catherine's tragedy was not only the loss of a young life, but the loss of a future that never had the chance to begin. In August 2022, an argument erupted inside the home they shared. Tense words quickly escalated into a direct confrontation. In that moment, Edward Figueroa made a decision that would define the rest of his life. A firearm was drawn. A single shot was fired. By the time police arrived, Catherine Gibson was no longer alive. There was no confusion about who had pulled the trigger. What remained was a silent scene, one where explanations held no weight against the finality of what had occurred. The investigation focused entirely on Edward Figueroa. There was no unknown intruder and no complex alternate theory. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events using the scene itself, witness statements, and physical evidence. Prosecutors argued that the act was intentional, not an accident, and not self-defense. They emphasized that domestic violence often escalates over time, and that the single gunshot was the final outcome of a long pattern of unresolved conflict. At trial in Williamson County, jurors heard detailed testimony about the relationship, the history of arguments, and Figueroa's actions after the shooting. Each piece of evidence reinforced one clear conclusion: Catherine Gibson's death was not a sudden, unintended moment, but the result of a toxic relationship that was never stopped before it reached its breaking point. In February 2025, a jury found Edward Figueroa guilty of murder. The court sentenced him to life in prison, the harshest penalty under Texas law. There would be no parole, no path back. For Catherine Gibson's family, the verdict could never bring her home, but it did bring a painful chapter to a close. The case of Edward Figueroa stands as a clear warning about domestic violence. Arguments that seem private and contained, when left unchecked, can end in irreversible loss. One gunshot in an otherwise quiet night ended a young life and left an impact that will echo for many years to come. Number 8. Ronald Yandel. For many people, prison is where power comes to an end. Steel doors close, influence is cut off, and individuals are separated from the outside world. But for some, confinement does not weaken them. Instead, it becomes a place where power is reshaped quietly, out of sight. Ronald Yandel was one of those individuals. He was not loud or attention-seeking, and his name rarely appeared in headlines for years. Yet within the guarded corridors of California's prison system, his influence spread subtle, controlled, and deadly in its reach. Violence does not always require a weapon. Sometimes, it begins with a single command, passed silently through the shadows. Ronald Yandel grew up in California and gradually drifted into a criminal path at a young age. In the beginning, he was not seeking fame or attention. His actions were driven by a desire to belong, to be part of a structure that offered power, identity, and protection. When he was sentenced to a long prison term for murder, Yandel entered the system already familiar with intimidation and control. But instead of being broken by incarceration, he adapted to it. Over time, Yandel became more than just an individual behind bars. He evolved into a symbol, someone whose name alone carried weight and intimidation, even without his physical presence. Inside prison, Ronald Yandel aligned himself with the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most dangerous and tightly organized prison gangs in the United States. This was not a world of random aggression, but a system governed by rules, hierarchy, and punishment. Yandel did not rise through impulsive acts, but through strategy. He was entrusted with authority, approving acts of violence, settling internal disputes, and making decisions that carried serious consequences. Within that structure, a simple nod or a few carefully chosen words could determine another person's fate. Yandel's power did not come from physical strength. It came from his ability to command others to act on his behalf quietly, efficiently, and without ever needing to be present himself. What made Ronald Yandel's case especially chilling was the distance between him and his victims. Many of those who were attacked or killed had never met Yandel in person. They were reduced to names mentioned in conversations, targets selected for violating internal rules or threatening the interests of the gang. One of the most disturbing cases involved the death of a longtime inmate, someone who had spent decades behind bars. When that death occurred, Ronald Yandel was nowhere near the scene. Yet investigators believe the decision had been made long before, carried out through deliberate silence and indirect orders. In this world, presence was unnecessary. Authority operated quietly, and the consequences were carried out by others far removed from the person who set everything in motion. There were no screams, no sudden outbursts of rage. The moment the line was crossed in this case came through phone calls and coded messages. Prosecutors described it as the point where violence became a method of control. Once an order was given, it set off a chain of actions that could not be stopped. The individuals who carried it out might change, but the source of the decision did not. Ronald Yandel did not need to be present. He did not need to act with his own hands. He only needed to give approval, and that was enough. The investigation stretched on for years, carried out through coordinated efforts by multiple federal agencies. Authorities collected thousands of hours of recorded phone calls made from illegally smuggled devices inside prison. What they uncovered went far beyond casual conversation. These calls revealed direction, coordination, and authorization of violent acts. Text messages, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and internal gang documents gradually formed a complete picture. Ronald Yandel was identified as a central figure, connecting operations inside the prison with actions carried out beyond its walls. At the federal trial, jurors heard how his influence functioned without weapons, without physical presence, yet with lethal consequences. Each piece of evidence reinforced a single conclusion: incarceration did not end Yandel's criminal activity. It merely changed the form it took. Ronald Yandel was convicted on multiple serious charges, including conspiracy to commit murder and operating a criminal enterprise. The court sentenced him to life in isolated confinement, with no possibility of parole. This was not only punishment for an individual, but a deliberate effort by the justice system to completely sever his influence. The decision to isolate him reflected a hard truth. Some individuals remain dangerous even while incarcerated. The case of Ronald Yandel leaves behind a chilling message. Violence does not always come from the person holding a weapon. Sometimes, it begins with power, with silence, with approval, and with decisions made in the shadows, where people believe no one is watching. Number 9. Robert Farmer. Some crimes do not begin with gunfire or screams. They start quietly through actions so subtle they are easily overlooked. In an ordinary neighborhood in Texas, few people paid any attention to Robert Farmer. He was not loud, not noticeable, living quietly on the margins of society. But that silence concealed a form of harm that would later shock everyone who learned the truth. It was harm directed at the most vulnerable, those with no ability to defend themselves. When the reality finally came to light, the community was forced to confront an unsettling truth: evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes, it operates quietly, causing profound damage without ever raising its voice. Robert Farmer was not described as impulsive or hot-tempered. On the contrary, he came across as cold, distant, and almost entirely devoid of empathy. Those who had interacted with him recalled a quiet man who kept to himself, avoided close relationships, and remained emotionally detached from the people around him. But behind that withdrawn exterior was a deeply distorted inner world. Psychologists later noted signs of severe psychological disturbance, most notably, a complete absence of guilt or remorse. For Farmer, the suffering of others carried no moral weight. It was reduced to a means of satisfying deeply troubling impulses that had existed silently for years, hidden beneath a carefully maintained facade of normalcy. There was no single moment that turned Robert Farmer into an abuser. It was a gradual process, one in which distorted thoughts were quietly nurtured over time. It began with small actions easy to miss, difficult to detect. Then, slowly, the severity escalated. Farmer sought a sense of absolute control, deliberately choosing those who were vulnerable and unable to defend themselves. Their silence only reinforced his illusion of power. Each act that went unchallenged pushed him further, until moral boundaries eroded completely and no longer existed at all. What made Robert Farmer's case especially heartbreaking was the identity of his victims. They were not people who could protect themselves or speak out. They were among the most vulnerable beings, entirely dependent on human care and compassion. In Farmer's hands, that dependence became a deadly trap. Each victim was a small life that should have been protected and nurtured. Instead, they were subjected to calculated cruelty and complete emotional detachment. When the truth was uncovered, the reaction was not only outrage, but disbelief. Many were left asking how a person could deliberately harm those who had no voice, no defense, and no way to call for help. Everything unraveled when signs appeared that could no longer be ignored. Neighbors and people nearby began to sense that something was wrong. An investigation was launched, and it quickly exposed a deeply disturbing truth. What had taken place in silence was finally brought into the open. That moment marked the final boundary being crossed, not because a new act occurred, but because society finally saw the harm that had existed for far too long in the shadows. The investigation focused on gathering physical evidence and expert testimony. Forensic specialists and psychologists were brought in to assess the full severity of the conduct. What emerged made it clear this was not an isolated incident, but a sustained pattern of behavior carried out over time. In court, prosecutors described Robert Farmer as someone profoundly detached from normal human emotion. The defense was unable to refute the evidence presented. Jurors were asked to confront details that were deeply unsettling, yet necessary to understand the true scope of the harm involved. The trial was not only about judging one individual. It became a broader confrontation with a form of violence that is rarely discussed, often hidden from view, yet capable of causing immense and lasting damage. Robert Farmer was sentenced to life in prison. There would be no return to society. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the ongoing danger he posed. Yet even with justice served, the impact of the case did not fade. It forced the community to confront an uncomfortable truth: how deeply abnormal behavior can exist in plain sight, unnoticed for far too long. The case of Robert Farmer stands as a chilling reminder that cruelty is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes, it lives quietly, hidden in silence, waiting until the moment when intervention comes too late. Number 10. Nico Jenkins. Omaha is not a city known for random killings. Its streets are typically quiet, daily life moves at a steady pace, and extreme violence is rare. But in early 2013, That sense of safety began to fracture. Deaths started to occur without pattern, without clear connections, and without an obvious motive. Within a short span of time, several people were killed by someone they had never met. The city was left unsettled and confused. No one understood why they might become a target, and it was that very randomness that spread fear more deeply than any direct threat ever could. Nico Jenkins was no stranger to the criminal justice system. From a very young age, he spent years moving in and out of detention centers and correctional facilities. Those who encountered him described someone deeply unstable, easily agitated, and shaped by a distorted view of the world. When Jenkins was released, reintegration never truly happened. He returned to society with a mind already fractured. He believed he had been chosen, that harm was his purpose. These delusional beliefs were neither restrained nor effectively treated, and over time, they became the guiding force behind everything he did next. In later statements, Nico Jenkins claimed that he heard voices and believed he was receiving instructions from supernatural forces. He saw himself as an instrument of a higher power, where taking lives was not a crime, but a ritual. The tattoos covering his face and body were more than acts of rebellion. They were outward expressions of a deeply entrenched and distorted belief system. In Jenkins's mind, his victims were no longer human beings. They became symbols offerings within a delusional world where the boundary between reality and fantasy had completely collapsed. What made Nico Jenkins's killing spree especially disturbing was its complete randomness. The victims did not know one another. They had no conflicts, no connections to Jenkins, no reason to believe they were in danger. They simply crossed paths with someone who was searching for someone to kill. Each victim was an individual life, someone with family, relationships, and a story that was never fully told. Their deaths carried no message and served no purpose beyond satisfying the delusions of the person responsible. It was that senselessness that deepened the fear. Because when violence has no logic, no pattern, and no warning, no one can explain it, and no one can prepare for it. In the short period after his release, Nico Jenkins acted repeatedly. The killings happened quickly, with chilling certainty and no hesitation. Each act reinforced the distorted beliefs driving him forward. There was no remorse, no sign that he intended to stop. Omaha was pushed into a state of heightened alert as residents came to realize that the person responsible could appear anywhere and target anyone. The final boundary of safety had been completely erased, replaced by a constant sense of uncertainty and fear. The investigation eventually led police to Nico Jenkins. When he was arrested, he did not deny what he had done. His calm, at times even defiant demeanor unsettled many who encountered him. In court, Jenkins spoke openly about supernatural forces and a mission he believed had been assigned to him. Mental health experts were called in to evaluate his state of mind and his criminal responsibility. While his psychological disorders were acknowledged, the court ultimately determined that Jenkins was capable of understanding his actions. The trial became more than a judgment of one individual. It forced society to confront a difficult question: where the line lies between mental illness and personal responsibility when irreversible harm has been done. Nico Jenkins was sentenced to death. The verdict reflected the extreme severity and danger of the crimes he committed. For the families of the victims, the sentence could never erase their loss, but it did bring an end to a chapter defined by fear and devastation. The case of Jenkins left a heavy and lasting impact. It raised urgent questions about supervision, treatment, and reintegration for individuals with severe mental health histories. When a fractured mind is released without sufficient safeguards, the consequences can be measured in innocent lives. And that is a cost no community should ever be forced to bear.